Hey guys, thanks for sticking around for the last talk of the day. Nice to meet you, I'm Brent Cohn, and I work at Twitter. And today I'm going to talk about ways I think about visualizing uncertainty in the context of helping business leaders make decisions. This is my Twitter, bjoseph. I don't really use GitHub, which is a cardinal sin, but if you search carefully, you can find some very old things that I'm not going to reveal here. So a brief outline of the talk. I'm going to give you a little bit of insight into, thanks. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do at Twitter, why it's essentially all visualizing uncertainty for people who have to make snap decisions of one kind or another. And then I'm going to blatantly rip off Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky and talk about visualizing fast and slow and some research to support why I think what I think. And then some high-level heuristics for how to choose between them and different examples of how I've had successes and mostly failures in trying to communicate nuances of information uncertainty to high-paid executives. So a little bit about me. This is a plot I made with no information about it. I work at Twitter, I'm a data scientist, and I work on a team that focuses on better understanding advertisers, their decisions, and their behaviors. And so we try to create probabilistic models of these things in order to I guess, predict key advertiser outcomes like spend and budget and you could think of like product mix and composition in the future, and understand how changing our marketplace or our product mix or other sorts of Twitter side incentives will affect their behaviors. So you can think it has predictive and causal components. But mostly what I do is I help key stakeholders make decisions. I help engineering leaders decide what to prioritize. I help finance leaders how to plan to prepare for profits or losses. And I help sales figure out what their quota should be and where they should focus their attention. What will happen if they focus more on Coke than on Pepsi? What's going to happen if Verizon spends 10 million next quarter versus what does it imply if they spend 1 million? So maybe later in the talk, I'll talk about individual projects I work on and how they involve visualizing uncertainty. So I guess the problem at hand is that communicating uncertainty is hard, especially when you're wrong. It's a little bit like the Yogi Berra quote. And so even if you hedge carefully and display that your models are well calibrated, as soon as the pivotal event happens and it turns out that the thing you said was 40% likely to happens, the media will castigate you, or your shareholders or your stakeholders will castigate you, and they'll think that you did something wrong. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, it's important to understand what the audience gains from your predictions and your models and your visualizations and communicate that clearly to them. And so I think of those things as sort of like three main categories. You give them central tendencies of the data. You think of those as like the mean or the median or the most likely, the mode, the outcome. You give them some understanding of the variance of the data. You could think of that as being like how big the tails of the distribution are, or like how likely is some sort of like tail outcome relative to the most likely outcome. And then the third thing you can give them is the ability to plan for contingency. And this gets a little bit into the causal aspect of my work, which is if we do X, how does that affect Y? And all three of these things sort of play into my key heuristic for deciding when to visualize fast and when to visualize slow. And so I'm going to sort of focus on how these things relate to the different choices you can make in data visualization. But first, I'm going to give an overview of why uncertainty is important. And so to do this overview, I went to the websites of a few newspapers and consulting companies, and I just stole their headlines. For instance, this is from McKinsey's homepage from today. No offense to anyone here who works at McKinsey. And if you read this sentence, you can see that they give an estimate. They give a probabilistic estimate for an event in the future. They say that the Internet of Things will generate up to $11.1 trillion of income by 2025. The unfortunate effect of that is that you have no idea about their confidence in that estimate, the range, the sort of most likely outcome. Is 11.1 the most likely? What does up to mean? There's all sorts of nuance that this language isn't very clear about. And later we'll talk about how language actually influences information visualization greatly. The next thing is plots can mislead. So I went to the Economist homepage and I pulled a plot from their homepage. And I suppose the scatter plot itself doesn't do a ton of misleading, but you can see that this line implies a strong relationship between the growth in food trucks and the growth in restaurants that, to me, I don't really see. But you'll have, if you gave this line to a business leader or a stakeholder, they would go and they would say, great, so if we have 800% or 8,000% growth in food trucks, then that'll cause an 800% growth in restaurants. When that relationship both is unclear from this plot and probably not represented by the data. And then finally, you might think you could find your refuge in statistics. If you just give your stakeholders the mean, the median, and the mode, then you're good to go. Well, statistics can mislead as well. So you might be giving them a dinosaur, you might be giving them France, you might be giving them X. It all has the same mean, median, mean, median, standard deviation, and correlation coefficient. And so I think in light of the fact that both language, plots, and statistics can mislead or lie, it's way more important to think about the medium that you're communicating in and how you're shaping your message in relation to the underlying data. So what is our goal, right? Well, our goal is to help busy people answer complex questions quickly. And we're trying to answer questions like, what is the most likely outcome? What is the average outcome? What is the midpoint outcome? Blah, blah, blah. So to get at this sort of central tendencies, the variance, and the contingency I talked about earlier. And so it's important to go back and look at those three plots and think about how each of them fails to do that. And they fail to do that in very different ways. The first one fails to do that through imprecision. The second one fails to do that through, I guess, extrapolation, or this terrible extrapolatory tendency. And then the third one fails to do that through too much precision, is that you're given this, like, measure of the mean down to the 100 millionth, and you think, great, if we know the mean down to the 100 millionth, we must know the relationship between these data points. But we don't. So I guess when I look to visualize uncertainty, I try to think about those three things and the trade-offs inherent in them and make key decisions based on that. And then the first decision is literally how much uncertainty to display to my audience and how to display that uncertainty. And so to steal the name of the Danny Kahneman book, I call that visualizing fast and visualizing slow. I rearranged the slides, so the next one isn't visualizing slow, but trust me, that's coming. So first I'm going to talk about visualizing fast, what I think visualizing fast is, when I use it, when I think it helps business leaders, and when I think it harms them, when I've seen it go wrong in my experience, and when I think it might go wrong in yours. A few of the first examples of visualizing fast I could find was this wonderful little density scatter plot by Sir Francis Galton from 1869 that shows people's heights. So the lines read 100 per million above this line of average height, and 100 million below this line. And so you could see this plot would help someone make a probabilistic interpretation about the population of people, that it's incredibly unlikely to meet someone above 7 feet tall and almost impossible to meet someone above 8 feet tall. And they'd be right. And they'd be right because the data is well behaved, that you have an almost Gaussian distribution of heights in the population, and that making inferences that come naturally to people about that distribution is correct and good. And so in circumstances like this, visualizing fast is the right thing to do. If you have a clear message, there's no nuance, there's no confounding or exogeneity, and your goal is to have someone say, aha, then visualizing fast is the right way to go. Another good example in a sort of spatial visualization sense is the John Snow plot of where people got cholera, or I think cholera, in 1850s London. And the key is that he put these little points in the buildings where people got cholera, and he labeled all of the pumps in London. And you can see, based on this plot here, that immediately adjacent to where the pump was, people got cholera. The message is clear, it's straightforward, there's uncertainty demonstrated in the plot. It's not the only place people got cholera, but there's no confounding to be present. So I talk a little bit about the research that sort of like buttresses these facts and some of the contradictions inherent in that next. This is a wonderful book, Information Graphics, Comprehensive Illustrated Reference, and the key point from that book and this graphic is you want to keep your uncertainty and your certainty visually very separated. And you can see that Sir Francis Galton does this, that Jon Snow did this, terrible, unfortunate coincidence, he has the same name as the guy from Game of Thrones, and that in my little plot in my About Me page, I try to do that as well, where you plot the sort of the midpoint estimate and then some sort of credible interval around it. So I think that's sort of like the most important part of fast visualizations of uncertainty, is that you say this is the part, this is the prediction, this is the certain part, and then here are the factors that influence it. Here's the uncertainty. A good example of this would be based on this advertiser's past spending behavior and their budget. We know tomorrow they're going to spend $100,000, but it's possible they'll spend $200,000, and it's also possible they'll spend $2 million. And we want to assign probabilities to those numbers, and we want to assign key events that would influence that. A key event might be a conference like PLOTCON. Plotly is probably way more likely to spend on a day like today than any random day, or some other sort of like key promotion that the advertiser is running. And so you can see how the person who wrote this book does that by visually distinguishing between the certain and uncertain parts of the distribution. The next part, which is from this lab at Washington where Mike Bostock came out of with Jeff here, is a really interesting concept that I think is really important, at least for me, when I try to visualize simple uncertainty, is that I simplify the plots. And so what these guys do in their paper is they run a few experiments where they give people different measures of a distribution and they ask them to try to guess the variance and the uncertainties in the distribution. And so the key point is over here, they show people sort of like your normal kernel density estimate, they show them these very uneven histograms and dot plots, and then they show them this smooth quantile dot plot. And it turns out people, when shown smooth quantile estimate dot plots, have 20% lower uncertainty. And this is a link, these are all links, so if you go through this, this presentation, you can click and read these papers for yourself. And so the message for me for this is that when I try to make these fast visualizations of uncertainty, I try to present what I know as clearly as possible, what I don't know as clearly as possible, and then the underlying distributed data in a simplified fashion. And so great, that sounds right, we're done. But unfortunately, that's not the end of it. You can simplify too much and you can separate too much. And so it's important to be able to, at the same time, keep your mind focused on what the outcome you want to achieve is. And then Amanda Cox has a wonderful way of summarizing this that I display on the next slide. But first, let's talk about that in the context of this paper. And in this paper, the authors have a really fun conclusion, is that if you show someone a bar chart with an error bar, just by itself, people are great. They can estimate what the uncertainty is, they can estimate what the mean is, they do a wonderful job of getting all the things you'd want out of a bar chart with an error bar. But if you juxtapose 2 or 3 of them, people have a difficult time, at least in the 3 experiments that they run, both with 3 and 2 comparisons, between distinguishing the high and the low of the 2 things and drawing inferences about quantiles between them. And so these authors say that when you're trying to make multiple comparisons, it's important to accentuate the uncertainty and it's important to keep in mind the continuous nature of your data. And I think that's right, I think that's true, and I try to keep in mind that balance in my own work. And so I guess to bring it all together, and this plot on the right I think exemplifies that, is you should know your goal. You should know what you're trying to convince someone of and be sure that actually is your goal. And so to do that, you should explore your data. And to visualize fast well, I guess, is don't be uncertain about the uncertainty. And I think this plot really shows that very well, in that you have these bar plots with the error bars, but if you were to actually visualize the underlying data, the distributions of the underlying data, you could see that there's a clear bimodality in the rightmost patient subgroup. And that is something that when you're visualizing fast, you might overlook and communicate a false sense of certainty. You can see these error bars are quite low to your audience. And so I think this is a wonderful Amanda Cox quote I stole from an HBR article with the source in here, is that, you know, when you see a good fast visualization of data uncertainty, you should know the outcome, you know, but you should feel it in a way you should never felt it before. It's like an aha moment, that like it's an obvious thing that you have finally seen quantified and different levels of it sort of separated for you. Great, so now I'm going to talk about visualizing slow. So I think the earliest example of visualizing slow I could find is this 19th century Chinese decision tree, which shows you a possible range of health outcomes of your child based on the characteristics of your partner. And I think that's exactly what visualizing slow is about. It's about that third characteristic when I outlined visualizations earlier. It's about contingency. It's about thinking of, if I do this, then what's the most likely thing to happen? It's about the Minard visualization of the invasion of Russia. It's about the relationship of temperature with the amount of troops you have with where you are in the geographic Russian steppe, right? It's multiple scenarios, it's multiple variables, it's multiple outcomes, it's all of these sorts of things that a business leader might want to know, but they have to have carefully separated for them and they have to be made interactive. I think this is something that like Plotly and Tableau are especially amazing for, is if you have 10 variables, but you don't want to imply this is the most important relationship, then you could create a dashboard, you could create an interactive plot and let people do that for themselves. I think there are dangers there, and there are definitely dangers there, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But this is sort of the modus operandi for visualizing slow. So the same lab that did the quantile dot plots, the smooth dot plots paper, has a wonderful paper on visualizing slow, in my opinion, and they do the same thing where they ask people about their uncertainty in the tails of a distribution, and in one setting they show them box plots with error bars, dot plots, et cetera, and then in another scenario they show people these GIFs of what they call hypothetical outcomes plots, and they're basically just like you show a point or you show a line drawn randomly from some underlying probability distribution that mirrors your uncertainty, right? It's your posterior or whatever you prefer to think about your outcome space as being. And it turns out that the people in their experiment are better able to quantify the uncertainty, which is to say, if you're given, you know, what's the probability that B is higher than A, if you watch this thing for 30 seconds than if you stare at a static plot for 30 seconds. And I think that's useful, and I think that's a little bit what the bar plot, third example from visualizing fast, was getting at. It's getting at, if you want people to make complex judgments about data, if you want them to say this is greater than that, or this is more likely or more probable than that, then giving them something dynamic is a better strategy to take. It's even present in visualizations that you see all the time in the New York Times. I think Amanda Cox is great at this. Is showing that, like, by making someone watch something, by visualizing the uncertainty dynamically like this, people pay more attention, people are more likely to engage. And I think this is where visualizing slow works much better, where you're displaying something that you're not sure about. The uncertainty is very unknown, and so you want your audience to really understand that uncertainty. So you can think the action of clicking this spinner again and again and again on this page, even though it's not really displaying anything interesting. You could display this in a probability plot very easily, right? It gets people more in tune with the feeling of what 1 out of 10 success really feels like, and that's visualizing slow. The third thing where visualizing slow I think is really good, which I touched on earlier, is making dashboards. And so if you want to have your stakeholder have the ability to alter what you give them, and this happens a lot, and they're like, well, what if we introduce a new product tomorrow? And then you have to be like, well, here, we can incorporate that in both our models and our visualizations. And so you could have a drop down, you could have something your stakeholders can interact with that interacts with the uncertainty in your models. You can think about this with regression models as well. Say you fit a regression to something and you believe in the standard errors of your coefficients. You can show them by sampling from the standard errors of your coefficients, given the distributions of them, how changing those coefficients affects the outcomes of your model, affects the classifications you get, affects the predictions you make. Those sorts of things are really easy to do in dashboards. I also think that, like, if you guys remember the McKinsey quote about the $11 trillion Internet of Things, visualizing slow is important when the language really matters, when you really want to couch your outcome. And so I stole this from another Amanda Cox talk in GitHub, and this is just a simple box plot of people's perceptions of uncertainty from an academic paper and from Reddit's sample data subreddit. And you can see here that if you're making slow visualizations, then you want to choose things that correspond with the most uncertain and most long sort of tailed phrases on this chart. Whereas if you're making fast visualizations, then you probably want to go with things that have narrower interpretations, depending obviously on the outcomes of your model and the uncertainty that you have. This is also represented in even how you frame things. This is also represented in how framing things makes your stakeholders, your business leaders, more likely to take one action or another. And so I'm especially cognizant when I'm writing emails, making decks, making presentations, especially things that go to external stakeholders or people like the board, that the phrasing is as neutral as possible and doesn't prime someone towards an action that I don't want them to take. And so what this shows you is how when the Kaiser Family Foundation gave a study during the Affordable Care Act, when it was being passed, rest in peace, where they phrased the public option as Medicare for all versus socialized medicine, how there were dramatically different responses to people's opinions of this reform. And you can see it's almost twice as likely in the Medicare for all version as the socialized medicine version. And so I think this is important to keep in mind when you're making dashboards, when you're making slow visualizations where people can alter your parameters. You don't want them to be primed towards one outcome or another. I think visualizing slow is great for when you have funky distributions. I put some carefully anonymized displays from my own work where you have these multimodal, long-tailed, hard to work with posteriors that people might not be easy to think about. It's hard for me to think that the median estimate might not be the modal estimate, might not be the most likely estimate. If you have multimodal distributions, it's not an intuitive thing to think about. If you have long-tailed distributions, it's not intuitive to think about. And that's another time where you want to have a sort of slow visualization of your data and have people have the ability to explore it. So briefly, in the time that remains, I'm going to talk about pulling it all together in a business context. So when should I make a fast visualization? What is that? And when should I make a slow visualization, and what is that? And I think there's sort of three key factors: your audience, your data and model, and your goal. So the first thing I think about when I make visualizations is how does my audience feel about the actual conclusion I'm going to give them? And if you think about Amanda Cox's map of New York's segregated neighborhoods, if they expect the results I'm going to give them and they're certain about them, then fast it is every time. A simple plot, bar plot, a table even, because they just want the confirmation that comes from seeing a graphical representation of their beliefs. If they expect the opposite, if I'm going to tell them that introducing this new product is going to lose us money, or that we shouldn't pay more attention to Coke, or something that's going to have intense resistance, then it's better to take my time, do something slow, and present an option of data that they can play with. So Plotly, things that you can interact with, D3 plots. Tableau is really amazing for this, so you can just automate the query that you think underlies your data, that underlies the decision, and then let them alter the parameters to see how likely or unlikely your scenario is. I think a similar but subtly different aspect of fast versus slow isn't how much they believe in your conclusion, but how much they believe in your analysis. And I think an easy to see example of this is sort of like the weather versus the New York Times map of different people's dialect distribution. So if you go on this dialect distribution map, it takes forever to look through and click through, but it's because you might be a little bit skeptical that someone could map exactly where you are based on the way you talk. I think of the same thing when I present people results of my analyses, because I sort of instinctively know whether or not what I did was very complicated and very hard to grasp, or if it's something people have seen a million times. And I think if you transition between sort of like regression coefficients and XGBoost, people have a difficult time where they don't know what the coefficient is on one of your estimators, something like that. And so I put a lot of effort into making those very slow plots of this is an XGBoost output, and you can sort of see how the covariates are ranked by importance, but it doesn't exactly correspond to some sort of like coefficient estimate that you may be used to. Finally, something I touched on earlier is if you only have one key covariate of interest, or it's a very straightforward relationship in your data, then fast is good. But if you want to show multiple relationships or explore relationships between your data, just like that GIF of the dinosaur turning into the star, then slow is better, because you're trying to display that dynamism and that interaction that comes from multiple covariates. Finally, is the model itself. Well, I guess finally is the goal, but finally is sort of the model itself, is how certain are you of your uncertainty? And so you can think about this as like an informational prior, or just like the information you carried into your modeling process. And if you're certain, if it's a straightforward model that you make every day, then fast is best. Again, if it's not, slow is better. And so I guess the final thing that I'd like to leave you guys with is like, if you're trying to answer a question, fast is better. And if you're trying to create questions, then slow is better. So that's sort of like my little heuristic I use. That's sort of like a way I think about the plots I make every day, hundreds of these things, the dashboards I make, and it's a little bit of how I've gotten feedback from my stakeholders. But if you have any questions or thoughts, I'd love to hear them too. Thanks. Oh yeah, go ahead if you have a question.
Great talk. You talked about it from the point of view of like presenting your work to a stakeholder, but if you're the one who's going to make the decision, then is it fair to say that you would recommend a slow visualization rather than a fast one?
No, I don't think so, unfortunately. I mean, I think if I had infinite time, then yeah, but a lot of times I'm really busy, and I don't really have the time to spend an hour or 2 hours or 6 hours thinking about something. And so I think you have, at least putting myself in the shoes of my stakeholders, scenarios where people have to make a decision in the next hour, right? And they just want to know, with the absolute certainty possible, what you can say. And there's sort of like you could think of them as being informationless fast visualizations, where you tell someone, I don't know. And there's no descriptive statistics or no model output that I can give you that would be useful. And so I think if I were a decision maker side, my key heuristic would be how much time do I have to think about this? And how important is it that I make more time to think about it?
Hi, thanks for a great talk. I wanted to ask, have you thought about, I mean, it was great. I think we face this problem every day that showing uncertainty in our data and metric. Have you thought about how you would go about doing it when the uncertainty is built into your analysis itself? So suppose if you were doing something like a Bayesian analysis, where the analysis itself has, hey, I'm only 60% confidence in this, and there is a 40%, but like overall analysis has an uncertainty.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the context that I sort of come at it from. And that I think that's, in my opinion, the most fruitful philosophical framework to think about visualizing and communicating uncertainty. And so all of these anonymized plots, these are posterior density plots of some output or another. And I use, I guess, sort of Stan and other probabilistic programming languages in almost all of my analyses. That said, how does that map onto visualizing fast and slow? You can still think of if you're performing some sort of Bayesian analysis, the strength of your prior, the strength of the information that you bring into your analysis, and sort of like the scale parameters or the variance parameters of your prior coefficients as being a heuristic for whether or not you need to visualize fast or slow. That said, in terms of like model interrogation, in terms of like inspecting your own analysis, I think it's always good to visualize slow. And it's like Hadley Wickham gave a talk on this, where like visualizing your models is a very slow thing and it's a very repetitive thing, but it's very useful to do as the data analyst yourself. I hope that answers your question.
That was a great talk. I really enjoyed it. I had a question about, do you try to keep track of whether the decisions that come out of visualizations end up later being accurate? And do you try to feed that back into thinking about whether, A, you made the right choice about a fast or slow visualization, or, in other words, how do you think about whether you did communicate uncertainty and your model was right in the event you're ever able to kind of think about that and verify it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's difficult for me to know whether, it's difficult to measure the counterfactual, whether or not a decision was right, but where you're predicting things, it's very easy to measure the accuracy of your predictions. And I track the accuracy of my predictions and try to make sure that my models are as well calibrated as possible, and make that as sort of like as public and accessible as possible. So I have spreadsheets, I have dashboards you can go into and see where we have pure predictions, the sort of past historical predictive accuracies of these models and how well calibrated they've been. It's a little bit difficult where you have sort of endogeneity in your data and that you like can't cross-validate or do any of these other sort of like reliable model selection techniques, like if you're fitting a time series or something, right? But even in those cases, I try to maintain honest interrogation of my models. The subtlety of your question is, how do I distinguish between when I give someone like a quick ggplot versus when I give someone a dashboard or something more complicated, and did I do the right thing there? I think I mostly rely on feedback for that, and that's something that I've gotten way better at, because I think my instinct is to always go slow, is to always be like, maybe there's unobserved confounding, maybe there's this heterogeneity that really matters and we should like investigate this. And as I've gotten feedback from people like, no dude, it's 2 in the morning, like we need a plot, or like we need the output right now, I've gotten better at distinguishing between what's better for fast and what's better for slow. And I almost don't know if the right way to evaluate that distinction is whether or not the decision that was made was right. I would say it's more like, was that as optimal as the time and the effort the person who was analyzing it had, and could they make that? And so yeah, so I send, it depends on the person, but I have these like Google surveys I send around and get people's feedback on sort of my output and my plots. And in general, they are like more fast, less uncertainty. Yeah. Okay.
Really great talk. I was wondering if you find some types of data more difficult to display the uncertainty of visually, like say spatially, like on a map, or temporally in the time series, or if you end up normalizing most things to a distribution.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think there are a couple different answers to this. I think the hardest kind of uncertainty for me to display is uncertainty that isn't represented by my model output. So I could give you a good example of this, is that oftentimes I'm asked to design like matching or inverse probability weights, or just difference in difference or regression discontinuity design studies, which are sort of these attempts to do observational causal inference, right? And I can come up with all sorts of like posterior distributions of the estimand or whatever that are right in theory, but could be drastically wrong in process. And so I think the hardest thing for me to communicate and to visualize, because I find those things like the same, is this inability to say, like, let's say there's some unobserved co-founder that completely explains my result, how probable is that, right? And to communicate that very quickly to business leaders, because they're like, great, this is the result we expected, this is the result we wanted, and I'm like, yeah, sure, but, so I can give you a great example of this. I had this model that predicted when advertisers were going to increase their spend, and it was working great, and it had this like great home run success back in January, because a bunch of advertisers increased their spend dramatically, like right when it said they would. And people were like, wow, you were like a prophet. And I was like, thanks. But actually what happened was Verizon rolled out free data on one of their plans, and every single telecommunications company all started spending more at once. And that completely explained why everyone was spending more. And it wasn't really something I could include in my model, but it was something that through sort of like interrogation of the data, I managed to figure out like, wow, all the telecoms companies increased their spend by 2 orders of magnitude. What went on? That's hard. I think that's hard to visualize in visualizations of uncertainty, but it's easy to visualize in simple like distributions of data. You color it by the vertical, you color it by regions, and you inspect your outliers. And that's something I try to do internally, but not externally.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
Another question, kind of unrelated. As you're doing this on a day-to-day basis inside the private sphere, are there any projects or communities that you're excited about that are thinking about this on the public sphere, say besides New York Times?
Oh yeah, oh my God. I mean, so like, yeah, I love Amanda Cox. She's great and does really cool work. I love Rachel Binks. I love Mike Bostock. I'm sure you guys have heard of Mike Bostock. He's the D3 guy. There's this guy named Noah Veltman who used to work for the New York public radio station. Now he's in the Bay Area. I think he's actually at Netflix. There's a guy named Elijah Meeks. There's all sorts of cool people who do wonderful data viz work. Like I'm not really a data viz person. I would say that I'm more of like a quick and dirty model, display the results for business analytics person that involves a lot of data visualization. But those are wonderful people to follow for data viz and if you're interested in uncertainty and the communication thereof. Yeah, no problem. Oh, sure.
Thank you. How would you change your visualization depending on your audience and especially depending on how like numerate or
Yeah, oh yeah, that's a great question. A lot. Like it depends. So I guess I've like visualized things for everyone from our like AI research team or whatever, God help me, to like our board also, God help me. And it's like very different what I try to communicate and how I communicate that. I think that my goal is always sort of maximum honesty, but with people who I think understand the workings of the models, I try to display that in a way that I think is very interpretable, right? So I display all the sort of like model diagnostics one might look at, like Cook's distance or something for linear regression. Whereas with key business stakeholders, I try to put this in the context of things that they can understand, right? Like I try to say that, like, I can give you a good example, is that when this thing happened last year, here's what this plot would have looked like. Here's where the median was, here's where the quantiles are, and it was 10% wrong. Does that mean you should expect 10% wrong every time? No, but like that's a reasonable estimate, and this is like a kind of like your standard default thing you should anchor to, and then here's what it looks like now. And so that's kind of like my strategy with, I guess, people who have little time but want to get some sort of baseline, is I give them what I think is an accurate baseline comparison from the past or a related scenario, and then the output now. So they could gauge, this thing was this wrong in the past and it was uncertain, and how is it now? I think there's like a real difference between continuous outcomes where that works really well and binary ones where it doesn't work, or like, you know, multinomial, or like, I guess, yeah, binary is a good way of thinking about it, where like, it's difficult to say if Nate Silver's model of the election was better than Sam Wang's, right? Because it's a question of probability. And in those cases, I really struggle, where it's like, you know, I was trying to predict an event and I was wrong. And like, who's to say if I'm right this time? I have all these calibration statistics, but you don't understand that and you don't care about that. So that's something I don't have any good suggestions, and I'm totally open to from the floor. Cool. Well, does anyone else have any questions? Well, thank you guys.